If we're going to talk about the first or the church in the 2nd century, you can not talk about the Roman and Greek world, or the Greco-Roman world as it's hyphenated into being. The Greco-Roman world was the empire at the time. Both the Greek empires that had come before and the Roman Empire that had conquered their territory, they were the shaping powers of the world, and so we have to approach them and understand what they thought. Tyler, you were here last time. Brad, a few other people were here last time. Who here can tell me what Hellenization is?
There was the Jews living outside of Israel, like the Hellenistic Jews.
That's the dispersion.
Okay.
Sorry. Nope, that's good though. I'm glad you remember that. That is the Jewish dispersion. That was the migration of Jews leaving the Holy Land to live in Turkey, Greece, Egypt, whether through war or voluntary migration. When we talk about the New Testament and we read of the Greek Jews, or in Pentecost where there are Jews coming from the Middle East and all these areas, this is the dispersion. Hellenization is a word used to describe the expansion of Greek, or Greek is also called Hellenistic culture. It is the expansion of Greek culture across the world. And so across mostly the Eastern Mediterranean and into the Middle East. Hellenization was the work that began in the 8th century with Greeks would leave Greece and they would establish Greek cities in Asia Minor, some in Antioch, like near Antioch, other areas in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they would establish these colonies to trade with people. What they would then do is then trade in Greek products, and that their culture would expand. However, that was not the main driving force. This began it, but what really ramped up Hellenization was Alexander the Great. For those of you who were here last time, we talked a bit about him. Alexander the Great was the king of Macedonia who went on a war, he conquered what was then the Persian Empire. And in a 4-year military campaign, Alexander and his Greek army defeated the militarily superior Persia and created the world's largest empire up to that point, stretching from west of Greece all the way almost to India. In the west to the Indus Valley in the east. One of the primary means that Alexander spread Hellenization was through founding Greek cities across Asia Minor and the Middle East. Records indicate that Alexander founded over 70 cities in his conquests. He would then retire his soldiers there, or he would relocate Greek settlers to those cities. The whole idea is you would build these cities in the Greek fashion, the Greek style, on Greek language, on Greek ideas, and from that point, their culture would diffuse into the areas around them. And it worked. Alexander would not, unfortunately, live long enough to enjoy his victory. He would die at the ripe age of 33 without a declared heir. This would begin the fragmentation of his great empire. His four general... Oh, sorry, I'll go forward a bit. I forgot about that. In the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia, went to war with and conquered the empire of Persia. Yeah, now we're caught. His 4 generals would attempt to take control of his empire, and they ended up dividing his empire into 4 separate warring empires. These empires would be the Seleucids, the Ptolemaics, the Pergamons, and the Macedonian empires. These 4 empires would then wage war on one another for the next 3 centuries until the rising power of Rome conquers them. Effectively, rather than having a single powerful empire, you had it break down into 4 separate empires who were then trying to battle each other out to rebuild Alexander's empire. What that ended up doing is weakening them to the point where Rome could literally just step in and say, we're calling the shots now. Effectively. By the end of this 3rd century, we'll jump forward a bit. The results of Hellenization were this. Firstly, widespread Greek migration. As I said, Alexander and later his the 4 emperors that would come, or the 4 kingdoms that would come from him, would take Greek citizens from Greece and move them to areas where the Greeks had never existed. This promoted migration across a very large area. Secondly, was widespread acceptance of Greek culture, namely their opinion of art, their architecture, their style of music. This would all be stuff that would be accepted by people who were not Greek. Next would be the establishment of a universal or near universal economy. The Greek coinage would now be seen as would be seen the way we would see the American dollar, where if you have American dollar, you can go to virtually any country in the world, barring a few now. Used to be that way. You could go to any culture in the world, even here in Canada, you could pay with American money and they would accept it, usually. The same was true with the Greeks. You could take Greek coins and go anywhere, almost anywhere in the Middle East, and it was worth something. This constituted almost a universal economy. The spread of the Greek language by the beginning of by the time Rome came to power, virtually everyone in the Eastern Mediterranean spoke Greek. It was as we would consider English today. If you don't speak English, almost anywhere you go in the world, somebody speaks English. That would be the same with Greek. The spread of Greek ideas, particularly democracy, the idea of citizenship, city-states, these ideas were, especially in the Middle East, where, especially what was then Persia, Babylon, they didn't believe in democracy. They did not believe that citizens had the right to vote or to own land or to do any of these things. The Greeks did believe this, and so that would be brought there. The value of education and literacy increased. Particularly, as we said, learning Greek, being able to write in Greek, being educated. This was a predominantly Greek idea that everyone should be able to read and write was a Greek idea, excluding slaves. That's meant to be a joke, slightly. I find it funny, if you're watching the movie 300, they're always like, freedom! We believe in freedom! Sure, you can be free, unless you're a slave. Unless you're unless you're a landowning man or an aristocrat, you're not free. But I find it very amusing. Jumping forward, we have Greek religion expanded, where you had Greek religion now being especially the Greek pantheon, the Zeus, Hera, Hades, Neptune, Poseidon. All of these were Greek gods that they believed in. You would now see these gods, or temples to these gods, expanding across the world. Lastly, Hellenization reshaped how people viewed civilization, as it would now be shaped around cities as the center and source of culture and life. So as we discussed, Alexander founded over 70 cities. These cities would now be the source of culture in their area. They would be seen as enlightened areas, similar to the way we would see cities today, actually. And this fundamentally changed how we view cities today. Hellenization would also have a far-reaching and long-lived impact on the Eastern Mediterranean. And so by the end of the 3rd century BC, Greek was so well known, it was simply accepted that everyone spoke it. Many cities now bore distinct features of Greek culture. For example, amphitheaters. The Greeks loved their arts and their music and their theater. And so I believe, the world's largest, best preserved amphitheater, I believe it is in Syria. It was covered by sand and it was dug up. When we were in Israel, they have a massive amphitheater in the Jordan Valley. These are distinct staples of Greek culture. They would go everywhere they went, they would build these. You would also have Greek philosophy would now be shaping the thinking of people who were not Greek, particularly in Egypt and in Antioch. Greek religious sites would also now be found in areas that did not historically exist. Similarly, when we were in Israel, do you ever go to Bamias Falls? Is in northern Israel near Tel Dan.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you see the wall of, did you go on the hike at all? Not really?
Depends.
Okay.
On
They,
not overlooking where they thought they might have tried to push these over the cliff.
oh, that's now, yeah. No, there is a site if you go in where you can see where they've carved into the rocks. So near Tel Dan on the north side of Israel, there near Mount Hermon, there is a huge forest. There is a natural spring that comes out of the ground, and the Greeks dedicated this area to the god of the wilderness Pan. And so you also had, I believe, there was a temple to Zeus and a number of others. And I think, don't quote me on this, I believe they thought there was an entrance to the underworld there too.
Correct. That's
Yeah.
where Jesus asked Peter, they say,
I believe so. Yes. And so this is an example of Greek religious cult sites now being brought to areas that they didn't exist before. Historically, that would not have been a religion that would practice there, but because of Hellenization, this was now brought there. Yeah, and fundamentally, the idea of civilization would bear and does continue to bear the mark of Greek culture. Early Christianity would be fundamentally affected by Hellenization. This can be seen in the fact that the entire New Testament was written in Koine Greek. The early church fathers spoke Greek and they thought Greek, even though most had never been to Greece and were not Greek themselves. And so the fundamental point is Hellenization took place before the early church, but it had a lasting effect on the early church. Quickly jumping forward, the next shaping power we have is Roman power. How did the Romans come to power and how did they use it? Where Greek conquest and Hellenization brought civilization to vast regions of the world, they lacked the structure, power, and unity to properly rule these areas. As we see with Alexander the Great, he could conquer a lot of land, and he did. But he had no foresight or planning ability to say, how do I keep this empire going? He was very excited to build it, but he had no idea how to rule it. And this is where the Romans sought to excel. Rather than being a single powerful empire that remained they remained divided and in competition to rebuild the empire of Alexander had ruled. This provided the opportunity for rival empires to grow and thrive and eventually make war with these Greek empires. It is important to note that the Romans were not Greek, nor did they live like Greeks, unlike their descendants eventually would. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans understood that structure, versatility, and innovation were the keys to building a great empire. They understood that you needed a strong government structure. They understood that you needed to be versatile. If you wanted to build an empire that's going to last centuries, you need an empire that is able to adapt to the changing situation of the centuries. And you needed something that believed in innovation of technology. You needed something that believes that we can do better. The Greeks did not believe. They were very classically minded. Their whole idea centered on the idea of preservation of tradition. Romans believed that they needed to adapt to the changing centuries. The Romans had already built a strong government style around the consul, who was an elected dictator effectively, who was meant to be the singular voice in a time of emergency. They elected the Senate, who was a group of powerful men who would vote on how the Roman Empire had not existed at this point. Under the consul, Senate, and under democracy, they were a republic. The republic would end with the rise of Julius Caesar and the reign of Augustus Caesar in the last part of 100 BC to 100 AD. Effectively, around the time of Jesus, Augustus Caesar came to power. He would be the first Roman emperor. They also believed in adapting to meet new needs. They believed in using new technology to their advantage. An example of this is when they conquered the Greek city-states, namely Sparta. Rome was using new and advanced military tactics as well as iron weapons. Whereas the Spartans, like we think of 300, the Spartans were the warriors. They were the best of the best. They got their butts handed to them, largely because they didn't know how to innovate. They would rather stick with the the military maneuvers that had worked for the past few centuries, and they still had bronze weapons. An example also would be Romans used coinage. This is just not necessarily militarily. Romans used coin. They used the denarii and a few others. The Spartans used iron rods. This goes back centuries before the Romans, but it highlights the fact that the Spartans did not know how to properly innovate. They didn't know how to move forward, whereas the Romans excelled at doing this, and this is why they were conquered. Beginning as a city-state, what would become the Empire of Rome began its conquest of the surrounding areas in 600 BC. By the beginning of the 3rd century, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. By 150 BC, they would control most of the western Mediterranean, including southern France, Spain, northern Italy, North Africa, and North Africa. This was due to a series of wars with Carthage, who is located in northern Africa, or North Africa. They were a largely navally based empire. They had a strong navy, but through a series of wars. So Hannibal Barca, we know him? No? Yes? He's the guy who took war elephants through the Alps to wage war on Rome. That was his whole strategy. Is like, I think he landed in either France, near France, took his elephants through the Alps and tried to attack from the north. He lost a lot of men. It was successful. He did win, eventually was defeated by Rome. At the end, these were called the Punic Wars. By the end of this, Carthage is completely destroyed. Accounts say that Rome salted the ground that Carthage was built on. That's likely a fabrication. Salt was far too valuable for them to waste it like that. But it signifies the fact that they completely destroyed Carthage. They were their greatest rival. Rome would take control of Macedonia through about 4 different wars that took place from 65 to over the course of 65 to 70 years, beginning in 214 BC and ending in 148. This left Rome in control of the traditional Greek homeland. At this point and before, Rome had already begun using its position of influence over non-Romans. And then, for example, they had Seleucid kings deposed or bullied them into abandoning any military plans or anything that negatively impact Rome, even non-directly. As we discussed in our previous series, Antiochus Epiphanes was an emperor of the Seleucid Empire. They controlled much of what is now the Middle East. He had made plans to invade Egypt, and effectively Rome said, back off. And he did, because Rome was stronger. And in a tantrum, effectively, Antiochus retreated back to Judea, and more in a tantrum, he decided to sacrifice a pig in the temple of God. This then sparked the Maccabean revolt, which lost the Seleucid Empire, Judea. And eventually the king of Pergamum, who had ruled in what is now Asia, or what is now Turkey, he gave the Romans control of his lands in 133, and Rome formed that area into the province of Asia. Syria was made a province in 63 BC, Egypt in 31 BC, and it would also be during this time that Julius Caesar would rise to power and begin a chain of events that would end the Roman Republic and begin the Roman Empire under the reign of Augustus Caesar. Under Julius Caesar, he did add Gaul to the list of conquered lands of Rome. At this same time, the Romans were expanding to the east. Their first exposure to the Greek way of life came through a Greek colony in southern Italy, which fell to the Romans in 272 BC. By the time of the birth of Jesus, around 426 BC, Rome had conquered the entire Mediterranean. As previously said, the Romans were not originally Greek. They were Latin. However, they began to, through their conquest and the slaves they acquired, they began to be infused with Greek culture and language. This would cause them to absorb Greek culture and merge it with their own, resulting in similar but different pantheon of gods and goddesses. In Rome, educated men would speak Latin and Greek. Architecture in Rome specifically would begin to adopt a Greek style. Yet Western Roman Latin culture remained distinct in the Western Roman Empire, where they primarily or only spoke Latin. Their cultural landmarks bore the Roman style, and their mindset bent itself towards Roman thought rather than Greek. Roman culture, for example, prioritized utility, order, structure, law, and duty. The whole idea is we have to understand that Rome was militaristically minded. They were bent on conquest. Therefore, their buildings were geared towards that end. And very utilitarian. They liked order. They liked they wanted things to be structured. Offhand, an example of this would be the Legionnaires' fortresses. Does anybody know what that is? The camp when Legionnaires would march, they would be expected to march, I believe, up to 18 miles in a day. By the time they were done, they were also expected to be able to unload, dig a trench, build a wall, and align and set up their camp perfectly to expect any attack. Their camps were measured, they were standardized, they were rigid, they were ordered. Your tent was not to be out of shape. Our military, the Canadian military that we have, and many Western militaries are based off of Roman style, where I'm sure you guys have seen the movie where the drill sergeant comes in, says your box and your bed are out of order, rips it up, do it again. Your uniform has to be pressed, has to be clean. This is all remnants of Roman style, because the whole idea is that order matters, standardization matters, and that is entirely based off of the Roman ideas. The Greeks did not share this. They had order, absolutely, but they didn't prioritize it the way the Romans did. The Greek culture, however, prioritized beauty, aesthetic, and balance. So when they build things, it's meant to be beautiful. It's meant to have aesthetic. It's meant to have balance. Yeah, like I said, it would be the difference between having a roommate who was from the cadets and one who grew up in band class. Effectively. Not to say they're not, that's effectively it. One is very arts oriented. The other was not. Rome was until they became infused with Greek culture, they were not art oriented. They had one goal, and that was about it. They wanted to build an empire, and they did. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Rome made little to no effort to replace the Greek culture with Roman culture. The Romans were active in the Eastern Mediterranean. They were building roads. They built aqueducts. They built Roman baths, hippodromes, which is the arenas, and they built many of these Greek Roman things. However, the culture and language remained primarily Greek, leaving half of the empire primarily speaking Greek and the other half speaking Latin. This dualism would play a significant role in the church even to this day. So to this day, as Protestants, the Roman Catholics are inheritors of the Western Roman tradition, where they preferred order and standardization over beauty and aesthetic. As Protestants, we are inheritors of that tradition. This is why we like our systematic theologies, or our systematic theology textbooks. We like that. We've been doing that for centuries. The Greek Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, couldn't care less. That's not to say they don't have theology, but you don't see that. They like their liturgies, they like their artistry, and they like their building or creating icons, creating beauty, creating churches that have beauty. Whereas the Western Church prefers to understand things through legal rights and non-rights. An example of this would be the Calvinist-Arminian debate. We all know what that is. Yeah. I'm not advocating for one or the other. I don't really care. At this point, and that's not my point, I don't really care. The point is, that debate doesn't exist in the Eastern Orthodox Church. For them, they are far more happy to give over to divine mystery than they are to formally figure out who has a legal right, or what does the more intimate details of theology look like. They're very content to just say, we leave it to God. That's not our purpose to understand that. Does that make sense? So, just an example of how Hellenization and Roman power that occurred 2,000 years ago, how that is still impacting our church today. The Mediterranean would come to be known to the Romans as our sea. I believe in Latin it's Mare Nostrum, because they literally controlled all of it. Rome was also now in control of much of what Alexander had conquered nearly 350 years prior. What's the time here? Sorry. Okay, we'll finish this slide and then we'll stop for snacks. Yeah, Yeah. The Romans would exercise dominion and control over their vast empire for centuries, eventually expanding it to include southern England, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, northern Africa, Egypt, Judea, Syria, Greece, Asia Minor, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and more. Rome became the inheritor of the great empires that came before it: the Babylonians, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Carthaginians. The Romans were able to rule this massive area through their love of order and law, but also through brutality and cruelty. Rome ruled with what I refer to as the honeycomb and the rod. The honeycomb was in one hand. This represented the trade, technology, the law, the freedom and travel, and the engineering and the peace that Rome had to offer. They would say, if you join us, if you are under our protection, you can enjoy all of these good things. However, the iron rod represents the threat of violence if you oppose Rome, which is destroyed cities, massacres, crucifixion, slavery, and the like. Rome carried both of these. If you were in favor with Rome, you could live very, very well with the best technology of the age. If you challenged Rome, if you challenged their idea of law and order, they were very happy to destroy you, and destroy you so much to make an example of you. It's not merely ending the threat, it's ending the threat to such a degree that you will never come back. Above all, Romans believed in the law of power. Those who had power had the right, and that mercy was not a luxury afforded to those who didn't deserve it. This can be seen most evidently in the Esquiline Hills outside of the city of Rome. This area was a mass grave for those who too poor to afford burial. This was also the sick and the slaves. No mercy was given to those poor souls by the Romans. Similarly, this can be seen in the Roman practice of exposure, where newborns were left to die in the elements if they were unwanted. In fact, we talked about bathhouses where Romans would build them. They had, has anybody here been to Thermia? Yeah? They basically built that. That would have been across a lot of the Roman area. They love their baths. But outside of these would be also popular places for prostitutes. There's no kid. Lawrence said make sure there's no young children, which there isn't. As a consequence of their trade, many of them had children that they didn't want. Usually outside of these bathhouses, a ways off, there would be a pit, and there would be and we would find baby bones at the bottom of that pit because they would discard their infants. The sick also were not cared for. If you did not have the money for a doctor or a family to care for them, then they would most likely die and their body would be thrown outside the city to be devoured by the birds. This can also be seen in so we see here, the Romans believed that if you did not have the power to save yourself, you did not deserve to live. If you did not have the power to do for yourself what others could do, then you don't deserve the right to live. One of the main ways we see this is in the Roman belief that the head of the household, the father, had absolute authority for those in their house, including the ability to sell their children into slavery or even kill them if they deem it appropriate, with no judicial oversight. Eventually, I read at some point, I think it was by the 4th or 5th century, by this point in time, Christianity had an influence on the Romans, and they would have this practice would have to be forcibly stopped because it was seen as infringing on the rights of the father. Don't ask me how that relates between grandfathers and fathers and long generations. I'm gonna level with you. I wonder that as I read it. I'm not sure, but we do know that was a practice in the early Roman Empire, or not even throughout the Roman Empire. Ancient Rome was not a place of mercy. If one did not have the ability to save oneself, they did not deserve mercy. This is the world Christianity was born into. The earliest accounts of Christians shows they would work to right some of these wrongs. They were known for going out and burying the poor dead. They were known for rescuing these abandoned infants, and they were known, even during terrible plagues, caring for the sick, even at the cost of their own lives. Christianity offered mercy in a merciless world, and has fundamentally altered the direction of human history as a result.